Final Fantasy has evolved over the years, and as new titles are being announced for next gen, I wanted to circle back to games that have been released in the last decade and show you guys what I think should be kept and what should be replaced. In this episode, I've put together a list of must-haves of upcoming Final Fantasy games based on what we've seen from FF7 Remake, FF15, FF10 HD Remaster, and FF13. So without further ado, let's get started. First of all, the real-time combat system works very well. FF7 Remake set a pretty good example where your ATB gauge fills based on time, the actions you take, and what you have equipped for each character. The game won't just let you spam abilities, spells, or items. Pressurizing the enemies and damaging their weak points was imperative. As a result, bringing down the toughest foes felt rewarding. Using the right strategy and effectively getting them staggered helped you bring down enemies to their knees relatively quickly. Character switching in combat was also done right in FF7 Remake. Provided you had ATB,
I'll show you what I can do.
You could issue commands to inactive team members and multitask to make the best use of their time. With FF15, this was only possible once the game was patched, but this was a year after the game's initial release. Ideally, this is a must-have that should be available from the get-go.
You better be worth the money, Merc. Every last gil.
Next, the game should not offer DLCs for the players to finish incomplete plot elements. In the case of Final Fantasy XV, this was directed towards the characters. Then, Square decided to consolidate these DLCs by introducing a season pass, and then eventually a royal edition. And if you're someone like me, and you platinum the game before these DLCs even came out, you'll find incomplete trophies as a result. And this is why my trophy progress was kicked back to 45% even with the Platinum trophy. Since Final Fantasy games run super long, a compelling storyline is absolutely crucial. FF10, in my opinion, is perhaps one of the best examples. Each character was carefully constructed, and their unique backgrounds fit right into the narrative. In short, the game's storyline managed to form a civilization based on a belief system of life and death, while somehow squeezing in additional concepts like unique languages, a new type of sport, puzzles to unlock new Aeons, and minigames involving chocobos. A solid story adds value to the gameplay and gives the player something to look forward to. Although summoning has always been a part of Final Fantasy games, it's hardly ever been consistent. If you compare FF10 and FF15, you'll find that these extremes are on the opposite side of the spectrum. With FF10, you could summon at pretty much any time Yuna was available. Here, I managed to summon Bahamut and then decided to dismiss him in one turn, but could immediately summon Shiva in the next turn in the same fight. FF15, on the other hand, did literally the opposite, where the players had no input on who to summon and when it would happen. While trying to test this mechanic, I had to wait nearly 9 minutes after repeatedly running around to get Ramuh to show up. The bottom line here is that the summoning mechanic should not be designed to where it can easily be exploited, but in exchange for a cost, the player should at least be able to decide who or what is being summoned. In FF15's open world, you could literally run or drive around for hours and lose track of time. Then again, you could argue that this was a missed opportunity since outside of exploring, Square didn't really make the best use of these areas. But it was certainly nice to hear teammates open up during these expeditions.
I want to ride my chocobo all day.
FF7 Remake was a strange case of having a considerable amount of draw distance, but you were always limited by the context of the chapter's missions. Final Fantasy titles prior to FF15 did have their fair share of linear progression, but I think Square would find it advantageous to continue allowing open world gameplay with a much better use of space. Characters in Final Fantasy titles typically have had a place in the game, with the only exception being FF13. In the case of Vanille, whose character is based on someone who hides their fear and guilt by showing an overly positive attitude in nearly every part of the game she's highlighted. Sarah was another letdown whose sole purpose was to motivate two other characters repeatedly off screen, but she ended up having somewhat of a bland personality in the sequel. Several times, both of these characters resulted in second-hand embarrassment for me whenever I had viewers watching my gameplay. The sphere grid system from FF10 was a great example of offering character customization options to fit just about anyone's playstyle. If you knew what you were doing, you had the option of having characters start at different points on the grid. Kimahri, for example, could be a mage, or follow down his standard path as a warrior, whereas Auron could take Tidus' regular path for increased speed over his regular heavy hitter route. Later down the road, Square reverted back to a single path for character builds, and one reason why this may seem understandable is because each path was tied to their backgrounds and weapons. However, I feel like next gen is now starting to demand more flexible options, so I would highly advise that Square expand on how players choose to level their characters. Side quests are great ways for the players to squeeze more life out of these RPGs, but things get out of hand when these become pointless and repetitive. Examples from FF7 Remake include rounding up lost cats or kids for irrelevant NPCs. Sometimes I guess there are side quests that may seem trivial, but have some form of meaning as an end result. In one case from FF15, you were asked to feed fish to a cat, but this also introduced you to the fishing minigame to get a hold of its mechanics. New Game Plus support is a positive for anyone since it ties directly to replayability value. I typically do my first playthrough in normal mode and then do a second run on the hardest setting to challenge myself. Although nowadays RPGs will have relevant trophies that will pop if you do happen to be a completionist. Additionally, the same applies to endgame content where you can either access new areas or go toe-to-toe against some of the toughest bosses in the game. FF10's Secret Boss was a nice addition for post-game fun, but it was nothing compared to how many hours I spent in FF7 Remake Shinra Combat Simulator. You were either somewhere close to ready or pretty much doomed to fail. So there you have it. As long as Square Enix focuses on these must-haves and doesn't repeat any mistakes, the next Final Fantasy installment should be solid. Thanks for watching, and for more on Final Fantasy and other games, please consider subscribing to this channel.